What defines your identity? Perhaps it's your name, maybe your family, your community. Now imagine a huge national census asking about this really personal thing about who you are. Sounds simple enough, right? But what if that question, that seemingly simple question, holds layers of complexity? So much complexity, it challenges the whole idea of a straightforward answer. And what if maybe the very act of asking the question actually starts to change the answer itself?
It's a fascinating problem, isn't it? And deeply complex. Our deep dive today looks at exactly the incredible challenges and maybe the surprising history behind the concept and, counting of caste in India. We're going to unpack why asking about caste is just. It's far from simple, both in the past and today. And maybe, just maybe, how our understanding of this whole social structure might have been shaped by the very attempts to measure it.
Okay, so our mission here is to take the sources you, the listener, have provided and really pull out the most important insights. We want to help you understand not just what happened, but why it matters. And there are some genuinely surprising facts along the way, I think. Think of it as a shortcut to being really well-informed on this tricky topic, giving you a fresh angle on identity and, social categories. Let's kick off with a modern question, one that actually echoes a historical debate that's, it's still very much alive. Our sources mentioned that India was looking at a proposal back around the 2001 census to identify and count castes again. This was something largely stopped after independence, except, for specific groups like scheduled castes and tribes. So for you, the listener, what do you think? Can an actual census really collect truly reliable, accurate information on something as intricate, as personal as caste?
That is the core question, isn't it? It's what A.M. Shaw asks in one of our sources. And if we just, set aside the politics, the ideology for a moment, the practical challenges of getting reliable data are just immense. Modern scholars, actually, they have a much deeper, a more nuanced grasp of what caste means compared to, say, their colonial predecessors. And this deeper knowledge, it really just highlights how incredibly difficult the whole exercise is.
Okay, so if we strip away the politics, could you walk us through some of those key hurdles? Like, what would a census taker actually face today trying to count caste?
Absolutely. Well, first off, who do you even ask? I mean, is it the individual? Or do you just ask the head of the household and assume they speak for everyone? A census usually works on the assumption, right, that everyone in a household shares the same caste. But what happens with inter-caste marriage? Or interreligious marriage, or even international marriages? Our source points to this growing cosmopolitan class. Often people in cities, higher education, professional jobs, their social lives, their friendships, even marriages, they often cross those traditional caste lines. Sometimes they don't really identify with a specific caste anymore, or maybe their family has multiple caste backgrounds now because of these marriages. So trying to put them in a neat little box for a census, it becomes, nearly impossible for a pretty significant and growing part of the population.
It's a really interesting point, yeah. And what about language? The English word caste, it doesn't just translate directly into most Indian languages, does it?
Not at all. Not neatly, anyway. Take Gujarati, for example. The source highlights this. You've got 5 words, often used jat, jati, shnati, varna, kam, and each one can mean multiple things depending on context. The source specifically mentions jati. It could mean sex, religion, sect, caste, tribe, race, lineage. So imagine an enumerator asking, what is the jati of your household? The potential for confusion is massive. People could take it in so many different ways. It's really not like asking for age or gender, which are generally, pretty clear cut.
Right. And it gets even trickier than that, doesn't it? Because even if someone gives a caste name, it's not always that simple. I heard people might sort of claim to belong to a higher caste,
Correct.
Or maybe use different names depending on the situation. Is that right?
Precisely, yes. Caste names are incredibly dynamic, fluid. Someone might use one name when they're thinking about marriage alliances, maybe another for religious stuff, and yet another when they're seeking government benefits or privileges. There's rarely just one single straight answer that fits all situations. Plus, you have migration, right? So castes are geographically dispersed. Members of the same original group might end up using different names in different places, sometimes deliberately, maybe to escape old associations. So trying to aggregate that data, pull it all together from different regions, you could be counting the same group under multiple names or missing connections. It makes getting an accurate picture incredibly difficult. It's kind of like trying to count apples when some people call them red fruit and others call them sweet crunchies, depending on who you ask and where they are.
Okay, wow. And the whole idea endogamy, marrying only within your group, which people often think is like the key definition of caste,
Yeah.
that isn't always so clear-cut either.
That's a really critical point, yeah. Our source talks about widespread hypergamy.
Yeah.
That's a specific kind of intermarriage, right? Where women from a group seen as lower marry into a group seen as higher. But the reverse rarely happens. Now, this practice, plus the fact that jatis weren't always strictly endogamous anyway, people didn't always just marry within their tiny group, it fundamentally blurs the very boundaries the census tries to draw. You might even see the bride's family start using the bride taker's caste name to gain status. So how do census enumerators, poorly paid teachers or lower government staff with limited time, limited training, how do they possibly navigate all these complexities in a quick doorstep interview? It's just so much more nuanced than ticking a box for sex or age. These challenges, they really show why getting reliable data on caste is just so problematic, even now.
Okay, so if it's that difficult to get reliable data today, how did this whole idea of counting and, defining caste in a census even start? It seems like it was full of problems right from the beginning.
Well, this is where our second source comes in, from Padmanabh Samarendra. And it argues something pretty groundbreaking. Basically, that caste, as we tend to understand it today, in academic discussions, in state policy is actually a new idea. An idea largely created because of those colonial census operations back in the late 19th century. Now, this isn't necessarily the view of all scholars, it's important to say, but it's a powerful argument in our sources that really makes you question common assumptions.
Hold on. So the concept of caste as this fixed pan-Indian system, it didn't really exist quite like that before the British tried to count it. Wow. That completely reframes how you might think about social structures in India.
Precisely. That's the core of the argument. The source suggests that both people who support a modern caste census and those who oppose it often share this underlying assumption that caste has just always been there, an indubitable reality of Indian society since ancient times, just waiting to be counted. Samarendra challenges this, suggests the idea was actually produced by the census itself, not just reflected by it. So the act of measuring, in a way, shaped the very thing being measured.
That's a profound idea. So what did people use before this sort of new idea of caste came along? How did they talk about social groups?
Well, they had their own terms, like varna and jati. Just to clarify for everyone listening, think of varna as more of a theoretical thing, an idealized framework, maybe like a blueprint from ancient texts, the four broad groups, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, big philosophical categories. But jati, those were the actual observable communities on the ground, incredibly diverse. These were groups often defined by, say, shared work, like lohars, blacksmiths, or sonars, goldsmiths, or by language Marathas, Bangla speakers, or religion Hindu Muslim groups, even gendered groups sometimes. The key thing is these jati didn't always fit neatly into those four varna boxes, and crucially, they weren't always endogamous, which makes them very different from the rigid, singular caste idea the British census tried to impose.
Okay, this is fascinating. How did the census itself end up shaping and, creating this new idea of caste? It sounds like the measurement wasn't neutral at all. It was an active force.
Exactly. The census, just by its nature, had certain needs, demands. If you want to count and compare populations across huge, diverse regions, you need definite, discrete categories, homogeneous units. Now, early colonial officials, many were Sanskritists, right? Scholars focused on ancient texts, religious scriptures. So initially, they approached Indian society through that lens. They sort of assumed the textual descriptions, like the varna system, perfectly reflected reality on the ground. But the census, it forced a shift towards empirical observation, actually going out and looking. And when they did that, they found that the varna system, as described in text, it didn't exist like that, not in a uniform, rigid way across all the diverse regions of India.
So the idea of this fixed pan-Indian caste system, it was really a product of the colonial administration needing to categorize and count for their purposes, even if it didn't quite match the messy social reality they were finding.
Precisely. It was a clear administrative imperative. Yeah. I mean, imagine you're running the British Raj. You're trying to govern this vast, incredibly diverse subcontinent. You need order. You need to collect taxes, administer justice, control populations. And for that, you need clear, definable boxes to put everyone in. So even if the data they collected showed all this fluidity and complexity, the need for uniform classification for a huge serial project like the census pushed them to try and define caste rigidly. It was almost like creating a governable reality rather than just observing the existing one. You see the struggle in the reports of census commissioners like J.A. Baines in 1891 and H.H. Risley in 1901. They really wrestled with it.
Okay, so what were some of the definitions they tried to impose, and why didn't they quite stick?
Well, Baines, for the 1891 census, he linked caste to status or function, but also brought in ideas about race. He had this theory about Aryans trying to prevent intermixture of blood with Dravidians. The source describes his classifications as basically a patchwork, inconsistent, incomplete. Then Risley, for 1901, he defined caste as a collection of families associated with a specific occupation claiming common descent and being almost invariably endogamous. But like we talked about, that endogamy part wasn't universally true for all jatis, and there just wasn't a single consistent scale for social precedents that worked across the whole of India. The sheer variety of existing jatis and local social hierarchies just made a uniform pan-Indian classification impossible to really nail down.
So what you're saying is, despite all their efforts, all these attempts to categorize, they never really managed to create a consistent pan-Indian classification of caste that truly reflected the actual social reality. Sounds like they were trying to fit something really complex and multidimensional into like a simple spreadsheet.
That's pretty much it, yeah. The source clearly states, no exhaustive list was ever made, no two census reports actually matched up in their classifications, and the commissioners themselves often wrote about their doubts, their misgivings about the whole project. The census authorities fundamentally failed to provide clear, consistent criteria for identifying or classifying people. It was this constant struggle, trying to impose a rigid grid onto a reality that was just much more fluid, much more dynamic.
Right, and yet the counting went on for decades.
Yeah.
Even with all these known problems and inconsistencies.
Yes, mainly because it was seen as administratively useful, relevant for governing. But they did eventually scale it back quite a bit. In 1881, for example, they only classified castes if they had at least 100,000 members. After 1901, they completely gave up trying to rank castes by social status or precedence. They just listed them alphabetically. And by 1931, that was the last time they did a general count of all castes. So here's the interesting part. While the census failed to clearly define caste consistently, it inadvertently generated and sustained the belief that caste was this uniformly definable, empirically verifiable thing. And that idea, born out of administrative need and the attempt to categorize, well, it persists strongly today.
Okay, so we've traced how the British, trying to define and count caste, kind of accidentally forged this new concept that's still with us. This historical angle, it isn't just academic, is it? It seems to have really practical implications for how we see society now. So how do those modern challenges that A.M. Shah pointed out, how do they connect directly back to this colonial shaping of the concept?
That's the absolute crucial link. The census wasn't just a passive observer, right? It was an active player, an intervener in social processes. The very structure of the census, needing neat categories, needing data you could compare across regions, it created this sort of dogma, this assumption that caste had a uniform fixed boundary everywhere, even when the reality was much more fluid. And this image of caste, this particular version of it, then moved from those census reports into state policies, into academic work, even into how people generally thought about Indian society. It became this powerful, persistent framework.
Okay, this raises a really important question then. If the modern picture of a pan-Indian caste system, fixed boundaries, clear hierarchy is maybe a relatively recent thing, perhaps even a bit artificial, a construct from the colonial era, how does that change how we see India's social history? Does it imply that, hierarchy or discrimination didn't exist before the British?
No, that's vital to clarify. The sources are definitely not saying that hierarchy and discrimination are new inventions. Absolutely not. Indigenous traditions like Varna and Jati certainly had their own forms of hierarchy, their own systems of authority, social order, various kinds of social distinctions and practices. That's undeniable. But the argument is more specific. It's that the particular, singular, supposedly empirically verifiable pan-Indian caste system that we often talk about today, the one with a clear, universal top-to-bottom ranking, that specific model, seems to have emerged from these colonial attempts to categorize for their own administrative ease. Recognizing this might actually help us get a more nuanced understanding. We could look at the diverse, specific ways authority and social structure actually worked in different parts of India throughout history, rather than just applying this one single broad definition that maybe doesn't quite fit everywhere or every time period.
That's a really powerful shift in perspective. So if this idea of a fixed pan-Indian system is largely a colonial construct, how does that perspective maybe influence today's debates? For instance, around things like affirmative action or reservation policies, which often rely on these very categories. How does it make us think differently about the tools we use to try and fix historical inequalities?
Well, it's complex because the sources suggest that once those categories were created, they took on a life of their own. They became powerful in shaping social reality. So even if the colonial census didn't perfectly capture the groups that existed before, the very act of creating those official categories and then using them for administration, in census reports, legal classifications, land records, it gave them a new kind of official reality, a bureaucratic reality, if you like. And that official reality then became the basis for later political movements, for policies, and at addressing historical disadvantage. So while the categories might have been, let's say, administratively constructed initially, they gained immense social and political weight over time. It means that the idea of caste, as shaped by these historical processes, continues to be absolutely central to identity politics and policy debates in India today. The construct became real in its consequences.
What stands out to you personally about this whole concept, the idea that the act of measuring something can actually create or reshape the very thing you're trying to measure? Okay, let's quickly recap the key insights from our deep dive today, just to help you lock them in for active recall.
Right. So first, the idea of caste as this single, fixed, pan-Indian system, it's arguably a product of those colonial census operations in the late 19th century. Not necessarily an ancient, unchanging reality just waiting to be discovered. It was more like an administrative construct designed to categorize rather than just a perfect mirror of a uniform social order that already existed. Second, this colonial concept of caste is quite distinct from the older Indian concepts like varna, that theoretical, text-based social blueprint, and jati, which referred to the really diverse actual communities people observed, with all sorts of characteristics and often not uniformly endogamous. Third, trying to count caste, whether back then or even today, faces huge practical hurdles. You've got the language issues, words meaning multiple things. You've got the dynamic nature of identity names changing based on context or migration. And you've got diverse marriage practices like hypergamy or inter-caste unions messing with neat boundaries. All this makes getting reliable, standardized data incredibly difficult. And finally, the act of trying to define and classify caste in a census wasn't just neutral data gathering. It was an intervention. It inadvertently shaped social understanding and created this powerful, lasting framework for how people perceive these categories today. This sort of dogma of a uniform, definable entity sticks around, even when the reality on the ground is way more fluid and complex.
So, if the very tools we use to understand society can actually shape that society, how might understanding this birth of caste impact current policies? Policies related to social categorization, or maybe even just how we think about identity in general, especially in a world seemingly obsessed with labels. What will you explore next about the unseen forces that might be defining our social world?